I'll give you $100,000 if you serve me in Chinese. Richard Blackwood's voice echoed through the hall of the Prestige Club, Manhattan's most expensive restaurant, silencing all conversation instantly. The green bills fell onto Jasmine's silver tray like materialized insults, one by one, spreading across the polished metal in a grotesque spectacle that drew the eyes of New York's elite. Jasmine Williams, 29 years old, never imagined her life as a doctor of linguistics would turn into a daily struggle for survival. Now, dressed in an impeccable black uniform, she served $5,000 bottles of champagne to men who didn't even look at her face when placing their orders. Richard leaned back in his Italian leather chair, a cruel smile spreading across his tanned face. "What's the matter, honey? Isn't $100,000 enough?" he sneered, gesturing to the 3 Japanese investors seated with him. "My friends here will judge whether your Chinese is convincing." The restaurant had transformed into a modern Roman arena. Other customers pretended to focus on their lobster dishes, but every ear was tuned to the humiliation show Richard was orchestrating. It was Tuesday night in the financial heart of New York, where men like him decided the fate of economies before dessert. Jasmine looked at the money scattered across her tray. $100,000 more than her salary for 2 years. Enough to pay her mother's medical bills, to get her sister out of a failing public school, to finally breathe without the constant tightness in her chest. But it wasn't about the money. It was about power. It was about Richard Blackwood, a 52-year-old real estate mogul, proving to investors that he could humiliate a black waitress just because he could. "You know what's best?" Richard continued, clapping slowly in mock applause. "If you fail, you'll apologize in front of everyone, because I bet my fortune you don't even know how to say thank you in Chinese." The Japanese investors laughed awkwardly. Fun. An older man with gold-rimmed glasses frowned in discomfort. Jasmine took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the tray until her knuckles turned white. For a brief moment, she thought about her old life, when she was Dr. Jasmine Williams, lecturing at international universities, known for academic excellence, before everything collapsed 3 years ago when her mother was diagnosed with cancer. "I accept," she said firmly. Richard's smile faltered. "What's that?" "I accept your proposal, Mr. Blackwood. I will serve you in Chinese. And when I'm done, you will pay me the $100,000 here, in front of everyone." While others mocked the waitress who dared to accept the impossible challenge, her calm eyes revealed a strength forged through storms and secrets. Richard clapped slowly, his applause echoing like gunshots. "Perfect. Then let's make this more interesting." He turned to the Japanese investors, smirking. "Gentlemen, you've just witnessed typical arrogance. This employee really believes she can impress us." Hiroshi Tanaka, the eldest investor, adjusted his glasses uncomfortably. "Richard? Perhaps it would be better—" No, Hiroshi," Richard interrupted, raising a hand. "You need to understand how things work here. These people live in a fantasy world." He gestured dismissively at Jasmine. "She probably watched a few kung fu movies and thinks she can impress you with a few words." The second investor, Kenji Yamamoto, frowned. "This is getting uncomfortable, Richard." Richard laughed loudly. "This is educational? You want to invest in New York? You need to understand reality. This woman probably didn't even finish high school. She works here because she's good for nothing else." Jasmine stood motionless, but her mind drifted back to the days when she was Dr. Jasmine Williams, professor of computational linguistics at Columbia University, a specialist in natural language processing, fluent in 9 languages, and a respected international speaker. Everything changed with a midnight phone call. "Your mother had a stroke. It's serious. Dorothy Williams, 58, her only family was in a coma. Medical bills piled up, insurance denials, uncovered treatments, endless therapy." Jasmine sold everything. Her apartment, her car, her jewelry, even her rare book collection. She took a leave from the university, then a sabbatical, and finally couldn't return. When Dorothy woke 6 months later, she was different, dependent, fragile, needing constant care. The debt reached $800,000. And now, in front of New York's elite, her dignity was once again being tested. She declared bankruptcy. The university filled her position. Colleagues stopped returning her calls, and friends disappeared once they realized she was no longer useful to their careers. Do you know what the problem is with you people? Richard continued, drunk on his own power. You always want more than you deserve, always trying to be something you're not. Jasmine blinked, returning to the present, watching Richard gesticulate dramatically, unaware that he was about to challenge someone with a PhD in applied linguistics from MIT, specializing in Chinese dialectology, who had taught master classes on Mandarin tonal variations to crowded graduate halls. Do you know how many languages I speak? Richard asked the investors rhetorically. English and money, and that's all that matters in the real world. Yuki Sato, the third investor, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. His English carried a faint accent but was precise. Maybe we should give her a real chance too. A real chance? Richard laughed. Yuki, you're too kind. But look at her. Really look. He pointed at Jasmine with disdain. This woman carries trays for a living. She can probably barely afford rent for a one-room apartment in the Bronx. He wasn't wrong. Jasmine shared a cramped apartment with 3 others, worked 2 jobs, waitress at the Prestige Club by night, caregiver at a clinic by day, sleeping 5 hours when she was lucky. Every penny went to her mother's medication, therapy, and survival expenses. But what Richard didn't know was that she still had access to academic portals, still studied computational linguistics in the early hours when she couldn't sleep, still corresponded with researchers in Beijing in fluent Mandarin, and that her thesis on neural language processing had been cited in over 200 international papers. Let's establish the rules clearly, Richard announced, savoring the moment. If she can make a convincing order in Chinese, not single words, but a full presentation of the menu with detailed explanations, I'll pay the 100,000. Richard, this really isn't necessary, Hiroshi objected, but Richard ignored him. When she fails, and she will fail spectacularly, she'll kneel right here and apologize to everyone for wasting our time. A heavy silence fell over the hall. Even the waiters stopped moving. Every eye turned toward them. And more than that, Richard went on, she'll admit she tried to deceive us, that she's nothing but a desperate imposter craving attention. Yuki shook his head, visibly disturbed. This isn't right. It's absolutely right, Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table until the glasses rattled. You want to do business with me? You need to understand how I operate. I don't tolerate lies. I don't tolerate acting. And I definitely don't tolerate anyone trying to make me look like an idiot. Jasmine watched with the calm of someone who had already lost more than her dignity. 3 years of humiliation had taught her when to back down and when to push forward. This was the moment to push. I accept all conditions, she said quietly. Oh? Richard laughed incredulously. Even kneeling and apologizing when you fail? Even that. And publicly admitting I'm an imposter if I fail. Richard turned to the investors, spreading his arms theatrically. Gentlemen, you're about to witness the difference between real confidence and delusion. What he didn't know was that every cruel word was feeding a growing force, a determination forged through years of hardship, about to erupt in the most devastating way possible. As the crowd settled in, expecting another public humiliation, no one noticed the faint glimmer of satisfaction in Jasmine's eyes, the look of someone who knew some battles are won long before they're fought. Very well. Let's begin this spectacle, Richard announced, clapping his hands like a circus director. But first, no cheating. He gestured to a nearby waiter. Bring the special Chinese menu, the one for our Shanghai investors. The waiter hesitated. Mr. Blackwood, that menu has over 40 dishes with very technical descriptions. Perfect, Richard laughed. If our language expert really knows Chinese, she won't have any trouble with a few technical details, right? Hiroshi shifted uneasily. Richard, this is becoming cruel. Maybe we should... Cruel? Richard interrupted. Hiroshi, you don't understand. This is pedagogy. These people need to learn their limits. He pointed at Jasmine. Look at her, still standing there, pretending she can fool us. What Richard didn't realize was that Jasmine was already mentally reviewing her doctoral thesis on dialectal variations in contemporary Mandarin. 3 years earlier, she had spent 6 months in Beijing as a visiting researcher at the China Foreign Languages University, studying regional gastronomic terminology. Her advisor, Professor Chini Ming, had been strict. "Doctoral candidate Williams," he would say in Mandarin, "if you can't explain a Sichuan dish using the correct Beijing tones, how do you expect to translate trade agreements for multinational corporations?" Jasmine had cried through many nights in her small Beijing apartment, memorizing vocabulary, tonal subtleties, and culinary slang known only to native chefs. She had presented her research in fluent Mandarin to a panel of professors who questioned her for 2 straight hours. Not a single word in English. As Richard waited for the menu, he smirked. "While we wait, how about you tell us about your experience with languages?" he said, mocking her with air quotes. "Where exactly did you learn Chinese? Watching movies with subtitles?" Yuki Sato, calm but firm, asked. "Richard, may I ask a question?" Richard leaned back, arrogant as ever. "You're investing $200 million with me. You need to understand how I operate, how I spot people pretending to be something they're not." He gestured dramatically. "This woman is clearly lying about her abilities. And if I can't spot such an obvious lie, how can you trust my judgment with investments?" Richard declared, his voice sharp with arrogance. Kenji Yamamoto shook his head. "That doesn't make any sense, Richard. Even if she doesn't know Chinese, it has nothing to do with your business competence." "It does," Richard snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "It's about integrity, about honesty, and about not tolerating people who try to deceive me." None of them realized that while Richard spoke, Jasmine was quietly observing every detail. After 6 months working at the Prestige Club, she had developed a peculiar skill, reading people, especially powerful, arrogant men like Richard Blackwood. To her, he was an open book. He constantly bragged about his Asian investors, always mispronouncing Japanese names and confusing cultures. Just last week, she'd watched him embarrass himself by trying to impress Korean clients with ancient Chinese traditions. The man was a fraud disguised as a businessman. "Ah, here it is," Richard announced as a waiter brought a leather-bound menu. "Special menu straight from our chefs in Shanghai. 3 dishes, each with a full technical description." He opened it and hesitated, his confidence wavering for a split second. "Well, there are a lot of characters here," he muttered. "May I take a look?" Hiroshi asked, leaning over. No, Richard said quickly, closing the menu. "She needs to do this on her own." He handed it to Jasmine with a smirk. "Come on, expert. Describe 5 different dishes in Chinese. Full details." Jasmine opened the menu and almost smiled. It was exactly the kind of text she had studied exhaustively in Beijing, full of regional terminology and culinary subtleties. "Can I choose which dishes?" she asked calmly. "Of course," Richard laughed. "Pick the easy ones. You'll fail anyway." But Jasmine was already recalling her presentation at Beijing University on the evolution of gastronomic terminology in Mandarin, a talk she had once given to 200 scholars and chefs. "Before I begin," Jasmine said, turning toward the investors, "I'd like to confirm something. Are any of you fluent in Mandarin?" Hiroshi blinked, surprised. "I speak a little." "What about you, Mr. Yamamoto?" Kenji shook his head. "Just the basics." "Why do you ask?" Richard laughed mockingly. "See? She's already making excuses. Oh, you won't understand anyway." "Pathetic." Jasmine ignored him. "Actually, I ask because I want to ensure there's at least one qualified person to evaluate my pronunciation, intonation, and tones." Yuki Sato, who had been silent, straightened in his chair. "I'm fluent," he said quietly. "Born in Osaka, but I lived in Taiwan for 10 years. My Mandarin is adequate." For the first time, Richard hesitated. "Well, that's perfect," he said, though inside he felt a flicker of unease. Jasmine's calmness was no longer irritating. It was intimidating. "One more thing," she continued. "You said this is about integrity and honesty. Then let's make it more interesting." "How so?" Richard asked, his tone suddenly less sure. "If I can not only describe 5 dishes in Mandarin, but also explain their origins, preparation methods, and cultural meaning, you double the bet to $200,000. The entire restaurant went silent. Even the waiters froze. "And if I fail," Jasmine added evenly, "I'll work for free here for a month." Richard stared at her, uncertain. With every eye on him, especially the investors, he couldn't back down. 200,000? He repeated. That's right, Jasmine replied. And a month of unpaid work if I fail. I accept, Richard said finally, forcing a grin and extending his hand. 200,000 if you succeed, a month of slave labor if you don't. Jasmine shook his hand firmly. Deal. What she didn't reveal was that 3 years earlier, she had been invited by the Chinese ambassador to the United States to translate speeches on international gastronomic cooperation. Live. Her doctoral thesis, Linguistic Bridges, How Food Vocabulary Reflects Cultural Evolution in Modern Mandarin, had been published by Cambridge University Press. She had spent 6 months in Beijing dining with local families, studying regional recipes and mastering dialects even native speakers struggled with. As Richard leaned back, ready for what he thought would be her public downfall, Jasmine took a deep breath. The investors leaned forward. The room fell completely silent. And then, with the poise of a scholar addressing an academic symposium, Jasmine began to speak in flawless Mandarin. Her tone, rhythm, and precision were so perfect that even Yuki Sato's eyes widened in astonishment. Good evening, gentlemen. Allow me to introduce our special selection for tonight, she said in Mandarin, her pronunciation so precise it rang through the air like music. We will begin with authentic Sichuan mapo tofu, prepared with 2-year-aged Pixian chili paste, following the traditional technique of Master Chen from Chengdu, she explained. Every syllable resonating with confidence, Richard blinked in confusion. Wait, was that real Chinese? Yuki raised his hand gently. Please, he whispered, let her continue. Jasmine went on. This dish embodies the Sichuan philosophy of balance, mala, the harmony between the numbing sensation of peppercorn and the heat of red chili. The soft tofu represents unity between simplicity and complexity. My God, Yuki murmured in English, looking at the others. She's not just fluent. She's explaining the cultural philosophy behind each dish, with vocabulary even native speakers rarely use. Richard's face paled. That has to be a trick. Jasmine turned to him, finally smiling. Would you prefer I continue in Beijing Mandarin, Hong Kong Cantonese, or perhaps Taiwanese Mandarin, Mr. Blackwood? She asked coolly. What do you mean by different dialects? Richard stammered.